Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this ARK seminar on a deliberative poll on education. What provision do informed parents in Northern Ireland want? ARK is primarily a web resource providing access to social and political information in Northern Ireland that's joint between Queen's University Belfast and the University of Ulster. And as part of our work, we have an ongoing seminar series that covers a whole range of topics. Today's is on education. We had expected a number more people to arrive, but I don't know whether Christmas is setting in early and people are cutting back on their activities, or whether there's been some delay somewhere that we don't know about. But we've decided that we will go ahead. The format is that we will ask our speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment, to speak for about half an hour, and then there'll be an opportunity for some discussion, questions and comments after that, and there'll be a light lunch at the very end where you're welcome to join us and continue the conversations if you wish. Our speakers today are two, as you can see. Dr. David Russell, who is an associate at Queen's University Belfast. David's been involved in a range of different research, but this particular poll is of tremendous interest and also feeds into his current work situation, where he works with the Northern Ireland Council for Integrated Education, but it's been done under the guise of his associateship at Queen's. His colleague today is Dr. OFlynn from Newcastle University, where he's a lecturer in politics, a political theorist. He's interested in deliberative democratic policy, and David and he brought their interests together to do this particular project on education. And I'm particularly looking forward to it because it is a methodology that hasn't been used very much here in Northern Ireland, and it's something I know a little bit about from a number of courses, but I haven't actually seen and heard the methodology relate to Northern Ireland topics. So I think from a methodological perspective it'll be interesting, and even more so the results that have come out of it. So without further ado, I shall pass over to our speakers and invite them to deliver their talk. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Gillian. What we're going to do is actually divide the presentation in half. I'll begin and David will take over about halfway through the presentation. As you see from the first slide, this is actually a collaborative project between Newcastle University, Stanford and Queen's. I think one of the things you'll probably kind of pick up on pretty quickly is that the methodology is actually quite complex. It requires quite a few people, quite a broad range of skills. So as Gillian said, I'm actually a political theorist, so I'd like to think I know something about the ideals that kind of underpin and drive this kind of project forward. James Fishkin from Stanford is the guy who actually came up with the idea. He's also a political theorist. We also worked with Robert Luskin, who's a statistician and a public pollster, who's really responsible for a lot of the quantitative and statistical analysis. And David is our policy person. So we'll do our best. We may not be able to answer every question because, as I say, the methodology is complex. It takes a range of different kinds of skills. So hopefully, I hope it'll work. Let's see. So to give you some idea what deliberative polling is all about, let me start with, basically a problem, or the basic problem. As you know, democracy means rule by the people, but for the most part, people have very little say. And this results really in political disaffection and what people often refer to as a democratic deficit. People don't feel that they rule. They feel excluded from politics, they feel disaffected, they feel alienated, and so on. And I guess the question is really, is this really a failure of representative government? Are our governments letting us down? Or is the issue really this one here at the bottom? Why should politicians listen to the people when the people are often ill-informed and uninformed? It's the old classic kind of Platonic objection against democracy, that people are just not capable of ruling, that people are ignorant. And there is something to that criticism. The critics certainly do have a point. And in a sense, conventional public opinion polling actually, well, I wouldn't say it makes matters worse, but it certainly doesn't do anything to alleviate the problem that people are ill-informed or uninformed. One of the big advantages of conventional public opinion is that, well, it allows us to take the public's pulse on a regular basis across a whole range of issues. It has, or suffers from, a range of limitations, however. The first is when people take conventional opinion polls, they don't seem to believe that their views will actually matter. And if your views don't really matter, you have no real particular incentive to actually reflect on the issue. You simply answer. You give a top-of-the-head preference, a top-of-the-head answer. So we're not getting informed views of people. We're just getting initial impressions. Very often people feel embarrassed about saying, I don't know. So again, they tend to make up an answer. And very often their views are wholly informed, or largely informed at least, in conversation with people like themselves. And what often happens with that is people actually become polarised in their views. Because if you only talk to people like yourselves, you become entrenched in those kind of views. So the problem is that conventional public opinion polling seems to suffer from a whole load of problems. Essentially, they can be reduced to one problem, which is that people do not, the preferences that people express in conventional polling are not reflective preferences. People haven't reflected upon them, and nor are they informed. So in that sense, I mean, I would never say that politicians are right to ignore people, but there is a serious issue here. The critics have been, for thousands of years, the critics have been saying that people can't rule because people are not reflective or informed enough to rule. Well, actually, there's something to that objection. At the most basic level, deliberative polling is actually viewed as a response, or it's viewed as an alternative to conventional public opinion polling, but at bottom I think it's also a response to this classic objection against democracy, that democracy is no good because the people are no good. So it's developed as a solution to both democratic deficit and the limitations of conventional opinion polls. To date, there have been over 50 deliberative polls conducted in a range of very, very diverse settings, from China to Bulgaria to Greece to the US to the UK. There have been lots of these polls conducted, and I'd like to think conducted successfully. Now, unlike conventional polling, which is really just a one-shot answer, you asked a question, you gave your answer, deliberative polling takes place over a series of steps or stages, which brings us really to the issue of the methodology of the polls. So the methodology of deliberative polling takes a series of steps. First of all, a random scientific sample is generated. In our case, it was conducted by Ipsos Mori on a door-to-door basis. People are asked to take a questionnaire. We call this the pre-deliberation questionnaire because when they're taking the questionnaire at this stage, they haven't actually deliberated on the issue. Effectively, the pre-deliberation questionnaire is exactly the same as any questionnaire that people might take in a conventional poll. You just, look, I've got a questionnaire, will you take it? Once people have completed the questionnaire, they're asked, well, would you like to come along to a day or a couple of days event where we actually get to discuss the issues you've just been questioned on? Would you like to do that? Now, we don't ask the question before people take the questionnaire because it can actually distort how they actually answer the questionnaire. So we wait until the end. Now, we do bribe them to come along. Well, we offer incentives. In our case, we actually offered people £75 to come along. We also made provision for childcare. And the reason for that is because very often vested interests will turn up no problem. People who have a stake in the issue will always want to come along and have their voices heard. But we work extremely hard to ensure that people who normally would not get involved turn up, because we want our sample, we talk about it a lot actually over the course of the presentation, we want it to be representative, not just of vested interests or people who feel strongly about the issue, but also we want to hear from people who think that, well, I really have nothing to say about this. Well, we think they do have something to say once they have become informed about the issue. So we work extremely hard to make sure that we get the broadest cross-section of society as possible, a genuine random sample. Now, people who agree to attend the poll are sent a set of balanced brief materials. Because again, information is key. If you want to have an informed public, well, you have to give them the best possible information, and the best possible information is generally balanced information. Or at least balanced information would be a necessary condition of saying you've got good information. So people turn up, and on the day itself, the deliberations actually take place in two ways. First of all, people are broken into small groups, again randomly assigned to small groups where they discuss the briefing materials. At the end of the small group session, the first small group session, which would last about an hour and a half, the small groups put together a set of questions which are then put to a plenary panel made up of experts and key policy stakeholders. The key stakeholders and expert panel can only answer questions. They're not there to actually engage in some sort of propaganda exercise. They can only answer questions. At the end of the day, this happens twice. So we have two small groups. We have a small group plenary session, small group plenary session. At the end of the day, we poll the sample again using exactly the same, well, slightly modified, but for all intents and purposes, it's really the same questionnaire again, which allows us to actually measure their pre-deliberation opinions, their top-of-the-head initial opinions, with their informed opinions and see what comes out the far end. Well, what would we expect to find? Well, as I say, we work very, very hard to make sure that our sample is a representative sample. In every society, but I think particularly in a divided society, representativeness is key, because when people get hold of the results, if they're not representative, people will just discount them. They'll rubbish the results. But if this is a genuinely random sample, we can stand over the results and say, this is what informed people would think if they had the chance to learn about the issues. All deliberative polls result in increased knowledge, and I think also better knowledge, because people have reflected upon it. I should say it's not just about knowledge, it's also about hearing what the other side have to say. It's what people from, in this case, our sample is made up of Protestant and Catholic parents. It's not just about the knowledge that they're responding to, but also the views of others. They try to reflect seriously on how other people think about the issue. We may get preference transformation. People change their views through deliberation. But we may not. Sometimes what actually happens is people get confirmed in their views. But although it looks like nothing has happened, it may well be the case that actually the reasons why people believe what they originally believe have changed. So their underlying reasoning and values may be very, very different. So that's a type of preference transformation, even if the preferences themselves haven't changed. Deliberative polls also tend to result in moderation. People's views come together, unlike when you talk to people like yourself, and only people like yourself, when people's views actually tend to polarize. Here what happens is people's views typically tend to move actually closer together. Will we get consensus? Will we get agreement at the end of it? Maybe, but if we do get it, it's only contained in the questionnaire. We don't ask people like, say for example, citizens' juries is a kind of in certain ways, a similar methodology. Citizens' juries ask people to actually arrive at an agreement, to take a decision at the end. We don't actually ask people to take a decision. We just re-poll them using exactly the same questionnaire. So there's no pressure to decide anything. In that sense, it takes the heat out of the issue, so people feel more comfortable about thinking through the issue, because they're not forced. They don't feel any compulsion to actually to arrive at an answer. Which I think from our poll is very interesting, because when David talks about the results in a minute, you'll see the issues are incredibly complex, and I think what people actually realised at the end of our poll was that, yeah, the issues are complex, and the people who are going to make decisions for us, the key stakeholders, they too are actually dealing with complex issues, and they too are not clear about the way to go. So these are all, I think, kind of key to deliberative polling methodology. So the next issue is, well, why did we pick education? We could have picked any policy issue, actually. It could have been anything at all. It could have been housing, it could have been peace walls, it could have been anything. So we needed some reasons for picking education. And the reasons were along these lines. First of all, we felt that education policy was a live issue that directly impacted on people. Parents have a real interest in education because it affects their children. It's not a kind of a vague issue, the constitutional status of Northern Ireland or something that, well, that's not vague, sorry, I take that back, but you understand what I mean. It's not as, it may not be as grounded in people's daily lives. So it's a live issue. A second important reason is that education in Northern Ireland is changing. This is partly because of falling enrolments, but also because of the introduction of the new entitlement curriculum. So in this sense, restructuring of the school as a state is inevitable. Also, a reason why we picked education had to do with this shift to area-based planning, as recommended in the report of the Independent Strategic Review on Education. So changes are happening. And the Strategic Review also recommended to go for some form of community consultation. So we kind of thought, we knew this was happening, we thought, well, actually, polling might be a good way of actually doing this kind of community consultation. So we thought we could actually advance the methodology and actually say, well, look, we've got a methodology for you. Perhaps this might be taken up in relation to other policy issues over time. So there were good reasons, I think, good kind of clear, grounded reasons why education. The next obvious question is, why Alma? Well, we chose Alma as a suitable geographic location for the poll because it fitted a number of essential criteria. First of all, it typifies much of Northern Ireland in that it has a large market town with a recognised rural hinterland. It has a mixed population of Catholic and Protestants. It has both primary and post-primary schools representing the majority of school types, and the schools are of a variety of sizes. Also, the area has been subject to a demographic downturn. And of course, we were also conscious of the fact that change might have been actually possible. There was a site becoming available in Alma that was being discussed as a possible site for some sort of, let's just call it an education experiment. So again, it brings it back to being a live issue. But also, as we say, we think that, although we'll be concerned about demographic representativeness, we think that Alma was pretty much representative of large parts of Northern Ireland. So given that Alma is representative, was our sample representative? The sample that Ipsos Mori generated for us. In particular, was our sample representative of parents in Alma in terms of demographics? Now, to answer this question, we asked a series of standard demographic questions, the usual kind of questions that you'd expect in a more conventional poll. Age, educational background, number of school-aged children, religion, employment, marital status, political affiliation, and so on. So let's have a look at these demographics, or just a few of these demographics at least. Now in our, let's look at religion as one of these demographic, is this not happening?
No, you have to do it single, one at a time.
Yes. You see, it takes a range of skills to actually run one of these polls, and you can see that the political theorists are very good at this PowerPoint stuff, but anyway. Well, for our sample, Protestants were slightly overrepresented, but I should say the differences that we got were not statistically significant differences. Overall, our sample was quite close to the 2001 census. I should say, just so you can follow this, the pre-deliberation sample, you can see the figure of 565. That was the number of people that Ipsos Mori polled on the doorstep. 121 is the number of people who took the poll at the end of the day. On the day itself, all 565 people would have been invited to attend. 127 turned up, and by the end of the day, we had 121 were left, so 6 people. It could have been the food at lunchtime, I don't know, but something happened, so they went missing in action. So when we talk about pre-deliberation sample, it's the sample in its entirety. And the post-deliberation sample is the sample that took the questionnaire at the end of the day for the second time. Okay. Just going to do this again. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Once again, given that this was a deliberative poll on education, it's important from a democratic perspective to find out, well, you know, where did parents send their children to school? And again, we found that overall the picture was very, very representative. You can see on the first column, you can see that most people. The Catholic primary sector is the biggest sector, so that's why this bar is the highest here. And although there is a difference between the sample and the post-deliberation sample, it's not statistically significant. So overall, again, we think we got a high level of kind of demographic representativeness on this. Just the same held, really, just to save time. Same held for post-primary. Just go on. So. I mentioned a while ago the briefing materials. In a sense, the briefing materials are kind of the vehicle by which all of this works. We want people to think about it, but of course, think about the issue of education, but if they didn't have balanced briefing materials, they couldn't do that. Now, our briefing materials really were structured around kind of 4 key areas: curriculum, school collaboration, denominational collaboration, and age grouping for schools. The briefing materials went through a number of drafts. They were seen by all of the key stakeholders, each of whom had the opportunity to comment on the draft and to suggest any changes. At the end, the briefing materials were actually signed off by the key stakeholders. So again, in that sense, we could claim that this was representative of the views of the various sectors on each of these issues. Okay. So of course, we've got these briefing materials. Now we want to know, well, did people learn from them? Were there knowledge gains? And in order to test for knowledge gains, we asked, effectively, 7 questions. We asked about the makeup of schools. You'll see them here. It's only to kind of spend too long on them. We asked about the makeup of schools. We asked them about questions about changes in schools. We asked them questions about the entitlement curriculum. We asked them questions about what people did when they left school. We asked them questions about funding. And we asked them questions about employment. So these were the questions that we asked, both in the initial questionnaire and in the post-deliberation questionnaire. So how did people do? Did they actually learn over the course of the day? Well, it's good to press the buttons. Actually, I should have done it well, because you can see, what you see from this is that there are actually huge knowledge gains. You see it especially, I should say the numbers on the side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that's the 7 questions that we had on the last slide. You can see these gains are very, very, very big. They're also statistically significant. So overall, what we can say is that, yes, just like all other polls, people learned an awful lot. Now, of course, given that it's a divided society, we want to know, well, how do Protestants and Catholics do relative to one another? Well, you can see that there were some differences. On some questions, Catholics learned more. On some questions, Protestants learned more. Again, I should say these differences are not statistically significant, because overall they ended up in much the same place, which again we can show here. So there were differences, but that could have been reflective of the fact that they started from different positions. So overall we have huge knowledge gains, and overall Protestants and Catholics did extremely well. You can see the figures here. There's some slight differences, but again, that could be accounted for on the basis of different starting positions. So. At that point, I'll hand over to David, who's going to talk about what all of this means for community relations.
Change the tactic where I stand up as I sit down too much. So what Ian has basically shown there so far, and one of the things about deliberative polling is that it encourages people to know better and to think harder about the particular issue. But also, as Ian alluded to in the introduction, another thing which deliberative polling is interested to find out is, do people perhaps think differently as a result of deliberation? And obviously, given the fact that this was a divided society, it was the first time a poll had been conducted in this sort of context, the obvious thing for us to focus in on was community relations. When people were approaching the issue, having gone through the process, did their attitudes, their mindset change on how they were understanding the issue of education, and perhaps how they understood the relationships to the people who went through the process with them? So we asked a number of things. First of all, we asked around the concept of good relations and whether they viewed the other side, if you like, Catholic or Protestant, favourably or unfavourably. Initially, you can see that the sample as a whole, the first time they took the poll, viewed Protestants favourably and Catholics favourably, and they thought, a majority of them thought that good relations between the two communities would only come about through more mixing of the two communities. After they had taken the poll, the second time, it was 121 people, we got shifts. However, the shifts weren't statistically significant whenever we compare what participants thought the first time round and what they thought post-deliberation. So basically, all deliberation did in this instance on these questions was confirm people in the opinions that they already had. However, we asked them some other questions. Trust and reasonableness. Things which I have to say, you might not think that, particularly trust. A lot of community relations work has been done in the area. One of the things about trust is trust takes a long time to build, or so we're told. You know, it's something that's created between communities, between individuals, over a sustained period of time through sustained contact. On these issues, however, we had very interesting results. Initially, the percentage of the sample who thought Protestants were trustworthy and Catholics trustworthy was around about the same, and Protestants open to reason and Catholics open to reason was slightly less than the majority of the sample. Post-deliberation, however, on both of the issues, there had been substantive increases in terms of viewing the communities as trustworthy and viewing the communities as being open to reason. Both of these findings were statistically significant shifts. So after 1 day's worth of deliberation, the view of the other, if you like, had changed for the sample as a whole. And also, when we break the sample down then in terms of what Catholics thought of Protestants and what Protestants thought of Catholics, and vice versa, again, the shifts were in the same direction. Pre-deliberation, people either thought that they weren't trustworthy or were coming up sort of around the mark of 50-50, particularly on the Protestants trustworthy, what Catholics thought of Protestants, just less than 50%. But post-deliberation, there had been shifts towards a more positive outlook towards the other. So we had statistically significant shifts in both of these areas. So what that told us was, generally speaking, as a result of deliberation, people had started to think differently, and particularly think differently about their relationships with other individuals in the Alma area. On the policy issues then, around education, to what extent did deliberation impact on attitudes in this regard? On the first area of the briefing materials, the curriculum, we asked people whether they would support the following options: a system of all-ability schools, a system of creating more specialist schools, which has currently been rolled out throughout Northern Ireland, or whether they would support academic and technical schools. Each time when we asked them a question on an area of the briefing materials, the status quo was always an option, and that's crucial because people might not change their opinion on a particular issue, but they might not also change their opinion with regard to how education should be delivered in that area, full stop. So in this instance, keeping academic and technical schools is the system that Northern Ireland already has in place. And it was a position which, perhaps unsurprisingly, the pre-deliberation sample favoured out of the three options, keeping things as they were. Post-deliberation, it remained exactly the same. However, there was majorities in favour of all of the options individually. And of all of those options there, the one which came out on top, if you like, was retaining the status quo. So deliberation didn't change the sample's view on how education should be delivered on this particular area overall. However, it did change their opinion on new options, particularly their view of all-ability schools and specialist schools. However, just to add the confusion in this issue, none of those changes were statistically significant at all. So actually, the status quo overall was the favoured position of the sample as a result of deliberation. On the issue of schools collaborating, individual schools working with one another in order to deliver education, again we asked them a number of questions. We asked them whether teachers should travel to other schools in order to work, whether pupils should travel to other schools in order to have subjects made available to them that might not be available in their own school, whether schools should relocate to a shared campus, or whether schools should share facilities, resources, maybe a technology lab or a sixth form, for example. Given the context, the outcome here was pretty significant, and it actually tells a story about the poll in Alma. On the issue of the shared campus, as Ian had said, we were conscious of the fact within the Alma that this was already, to some degree, in a public discourse around that had emerged, particularly around the area of the barracks. And as a result of deliberation, the pre-deliberation sample were in favour of a shared campus, but post-deliberation they had slightly decreased, whilst the majority still remained in favour of sharing a campus, 56%. It was less than the first time round. And interestingly, of all those results there, that was the only shift that had statistical significance. So people had moved away from favouring a shared campus. I'm going to come back to the issue. I can only draw a hypothesis of why that would be the case. But quite often with conventional opinion polling, one of the things that it's often criticised for is people would think like that when they're asked that question. This is aspirational, particularly around, I think, the social attitude survey, around their attitudes towards mixing with the other. Yes, in an ideal world, people would want to mix, or alternatively, people say, well, yes, they would say that because that's what the perhaps the person taking the questions would expect them to respond, so they respond in kind to what they think they would be required to say. In this instance, you might have thought that the questionnaire would have resulted in people wanting to go for a shared campus if they were responding in kind, but actually no. As parents became more knowledgeable, as parents became more informed about the issue and had the opportunity to deliberate with one another, they became more cautious about supporting the single area of public policy with regard to education that was most live in Omagh. So whilst generally there was a move towards school collaboration, bringing people together as an aspirational goal, one day's deliberation resulted in parents becoming cautious about the single issue that was most live in Omagh. Now, to the extent of which that was informing their deliberations within their small groups, we can't say, but we can say this is how they thought as a result of the process. With the issue of denominational collaboration, then, another area of the briefing materials, essentially the religious element of schools, what would their attitude be? Something else we're very interested to find out, particularly given the nature of the schools estate in Northern Ireland generally, but also in Omagh in particular. Almost all school types possible in Northern Ireland are represented in Omagh, bar at post-primary level Irish medium education, but they do have primary provision, and Coyle did inform us that they would see it as a site potentially for post-primary provision. Again, here, majority supported collaboration, so sharing was something that parents wanted to see, at least aspirationally, the first time they took the poll on the doorstep. We asked them whether they would want pupils to mix in classes, so if they were collaborating, if schools were collaborating with each other or had to collaborate with each other, should the children from the different schools be located within the same class, a mixed class of Protestants and Catholics typically, if they were coming from the controlled or maintained sector. We also asked them if they had to partner with their closest school to deliver the curriculum, particularly the new entitlement framework, should they do it with their closest partner? And we also asked them, should they be required, if they don't have a mix within their school, should they be required to engage in a cross-sectoral partnership? In other words, should a majority Catholic school be required to partner a predominantly Protestant school and vice versa? In this instance, a bit like the more grounded example of the shared campus, it was very interesting in that we had a statistically significant shift on the second question, which tells us one of two things. First of all, again, parents, as with the other slides, were in favour of collaboration and sharing generally, and that held up as a result of deliberation. But also, perhaps more interestingly, when parents had the opportunity to become better informed and more knowledgeable about the issue, they thought very practically in terms of educational delivery for their children. So mixing of religions wasn't actually foremost in their mind. What was more important to them was a school, regardless of what type of school was next door to them. Their favourite position was that two schools that sit alongside each other, regardless of what they are, should have to collaborate. So their closest partner, a very practical way of delivering the curriculum. So parents were thinking differently. With regard to the school types, the fourth area of the briefing materials, we offered them different types of schools. One again, as with all the other slides, was to retain the status quo. Should we keep all of the schools that we currently have in Omagh and just keep things as they are? The alternative was, should we create a new type of school, one that currently doesn't exist in Northern Ireland, a jointly managed school between the two predominant faiths? Or should we create an already established type of shared school, more integrated schools? On these three areas, again, taken individually, parents were supportive. However, after deliberation, we get shifts in opinion. Now, the first two weren't statistically significant shifts, so basically people were just held their original position as a result of deliberation on the particular issue. But with regard to retaining all types of schools, we started off with a majority of 60%, and after deliberation it had dropped to less than a majority, 43%, and it was a statistically significant shift. So in this issue, parents, what this indicates, were open to change. what that change might be. You have to take the bigger picture of the poll, but parents, as a result of deliberation, were open to not necessarily keeping all of the types of schools that are currently in Alma. And the final area was the age grouping of schools, something which has only been discussed this week with Katrina's announcement. So what did people think about how schools should be structured in terms of age? On these two questions, again, keeping the traditional pattern, parents opted, of all of the options, the most favoured option was to keep things as they currently are, the status quo. However, after deliberation, they had changed their opinion across all of the areas, and two of them are of statistical significance. Get the word out. The sixth form colleges and the traditional pattern were the ones that seen the largest shifts, and those are the ones which were of most relevance to us. So parents had started from a position where they favoured, where they weren't necessarily in favour, a majority wasn't in support of a joint sixth form college. But after deliberation, a majority of them were in favour of a joint sixth form college. They had changed their position quite radically on that issue. And with regard, again, to keeping the traditional pattern of schools for the 11 to 19, they had changed their position and moved away from it. So parents were open for change. Although a majority did remain in favour of it, at the same time, the support for it had withered as a result of having the opportunity to discuss the issues. Okay. Sorry, I should say something else just here on this issue. The junior and senior highs. As a result of deliberation, the most favoured option across the four options here was to shift to a system of junior and senior highs at post-primary. So 11 to 14, 14 to 19 schools. However, on this issue, the shift wasn't really significant. So whilst this might be the position that parents favoured out of all of the options, they were only confirmed in their opinion. And we had a slight other problem on this issue in that the representativeness of the sample on this question in particular is in question. And the reason why it's in question is because not enough people answered the question, obviously. Don't know was always an option. And either I don't know or just fail to answer the question. But we can't say this is what informed parents want, but what we can't say with a degree of certainty in that particular question was that the sample was representative. Okay, so briefly, to summarise, what did the whole process tell us about what informed parents want? Well, first of all, these are all statistically significant shifts. Parents are open to change. As a result of deliberation, there is room to manoeuvre. If you were a policy maker in Northern Ireland and you were charged with looking at the schools estate in Alma, there is room to manoeuvre on how education would be delivered in Alma. The parents were clearly open to change. First of all, on a related issue of community relations, and I've deliberately kept this question out of the community relations section when I was talking about it, we asked them, do you think changes in the education system can be of equal benefit to all children, regardless of their community background? Parents had changed their position from the first time they took the poll to the second time they took the poll in favour of that statement. So they were thinking about the issue differently, and the way in which they were thinking about the issue was one of, if you like, and maybe Ian will say something about this in the questions, they were thinking more in terms of as citizens rather than as members of a particular community. And also in terms of change with regard to the particular types of schools that we have in Northern Ireland, the parents had moved away from supporting the status quo. They had moved from a majority in support of retaining all types of schools that are currently in Alma to a minority view. And they had also moved from keeping the traditional age pattern of schools to actually, whilst the majority, the opposition to that had increased substantially. So parents have become more open to change. And what do they want? Well, having taken all the data, what we can say is, first of all, unsurprisingly, they want good, sustainable schools, with the option potentially of specialist schools in Alma. That across all the areas there was a shift in terms of collaboration and sharing. So as far as a policy agenda would be concerned, parents want to see more sharing, they want to see more collaboration. They want to see it done in very practical terms. schools, regardless of type, partnering with their closest school in order to deliver education for children. And they want to see mixed education, including pupils spending more time in mixed classes. Not necessarily mixed schools, but they want to see more mixing in terms of religions, regardless of school type. They want a reduction in the number of school types, or they're at least open to the reduction in the number of school types. They held their view with regard to more integrated schools. So all the poll did, the deliberative poll in this instance, was uphold social attitude surveys that have been conducted in Northern Ireland for many years with regard to integration, but upheld that view in a slightly different way, in that, first of all, they had the opportunity to become more knowledgeable about what integrated schools were, and secondly, they had the option of realising that this might be a very real possibility in Alma if they were to support it. So it was more set in a concrete framework for them, in which their hand was being slightly forced on the issue. So what we can say about that issue in particular was, it isn't just a question of that is what you would say, because that's what you expect me to say. No, this is what parents who have had the opportunity to think more about the issue and be more knowledgeable about the issue would say with regard to integrated education. The option for jointly managed schools, things that don't currently exist in Northern Ireland. As part of being open to change, parents are open to changes in delivering education in ways that it just hasn't been done at all in the past. And finally, on the issue of junior and senior highs, perhaps pertinent given the 11+ debate this week, parents are open to junior and senior highs, but there is a question, like I said, about the representativeness of that position with our poll. And most importantly of all, and just to finish off, it was quite clear, and I know some people in the room took part in the poll, parents want to be informed. Consultation exercises are critical to it, and I think the reason, just to come back on the issue that I had discussed before, particularly around that issue of a shared campus in Alma, the fact that parents were exercising caution from what they had previously said in deliberation shows that parents want to know more about that option if it's going to be presented to them. But they are open for change, so it's up to policymakers to convince them that this change will be for the better. And that's us.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Oh, I found that absolutely fascinating, and I have a load of questions, but I'll just open the floor for comments, observations. I didn't know some people in the room had been involved, so maybe you've got something to add as well. But yeah, okay, so the gentleman at the back first, and then Dirk. Sorry, the gentleman with the red. Yeah, just watch.
Thank you. Forget the question. Yeah, Ian, in your opening few remarks, you mentioned about in conventional polls that politicians are unlikely to pay any attention to them because of the various reasons. Are they any more likely to listen to this? You know, at the end of the day, politicians being what they are.
Sorry, if you don't mind, I'll just take a couple of questions and then you can come back on the number.
And the sort of corollary to that is, were the numbers involved in that deliberative poll sufficient to use as a proper consultative document, for want of a better word? Thanks.
If you just pass it in front to Dirk. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. I have two questions as well. The first one is, when you showed the demographics of the poll, it appeared that past the consultation, there was a higher percentage of Protestants than Catholics compared to prior. Did you account for that? Did you weigh the data when you looked at the? Did you weigh the data when you looked at the results? And the second one is, have there been any experiments of how long-lasting the changes in attitudes are? Do you know of any deliberative poll exercises where researchers went back after a year and see how lasting the changes are?
Okay, we'll take one from Francis as well. And then Cynthia, you can ask a question.
Thanks. I was there on the day. I participated as one of the facilitators of the groups of parents. And I suppose the comment I would make overall of the day was what struck me was how threatened the panel of experts were at having a room full of informed parents. So I think lesson number one is policymakers do not want to hear from people who know what they're talking about, because that makes their lives extremely troublesome. And you know, that's a very big lesson about how we do business in Northern Ireland. My question is, about the drop-off in numbers between, I mean, clearly built into this methodology, the fact that you can't ask people to commit to the process before they fill out the initial questionnaire means that you're potentially going to have quite a large drop-off when you say to them, and we'd like you to commit to this process, because that's a different thing than just answering a few questions. And so the numbers on the day, although they felt large, and it was a large gathering, and certainly much larger than most other public consultation exercises I've ever been at, and you would rarely get 172 responses to any government consultation. So it felt like a large number in the day, but compared to the original pre-deliberative exercise, it's not that large. So how do you know if all the bigots just didn't stay at home, for example, so that on the day the results are, yes, Protestants are trustworthy and Catholics are trustworthy? What if those were just the people who thought that anyway, and they happened to be the people who turned out? Is there any way of measuring for those sorts of effects?
Okay.
Oh, right, okay, thanks. The first question on politicians...
Sorry, I don't think you need this.
No,
yeah, that's okay. Sorry.
I wasn't pointing in the right direction.
No, it's just probably clashing with the one on our table.
Okay. The first question, are politicians any more likely to listen? Yeah, it's a really good question, and of course, that's what we're wondering now. Is this being taken up by policymakers? Will it shape policy? It's a bit like the French, Mao's answer to the French Revolution. It's too early to tell, but I should say there's something that I didn't mention in all of this. At least as I understand it, deliberative democracy, of which deliberative polling is a particular realisation, is based very much around kind of two key values. The first is what's often referred to as reciprocity, which really has to do with the give and take of reasons, and the willingness to be responsive and reflect upon the reasons that you hear put forward by other people. And that's how you're getting these kind of community relationships that Dave was talking about. It's not just about knowledge, it's actually, as I say, reflecting upon and being responsive to what other people are saying. But the second value that I didn't mention that underpins all of this is actually the value of publicity. Now, our poll was televised, it was filmed by BBC Northern Ireland, and it was the subject of a Hearts and Minds special. And the idea behind this is that, well, politicians will react to incentives if this isn't seen. If people's informed views never make it into the public domain, if there isn't much attention drawn to what informed people would think as opposed to what uninformed people would think, well, yes, they'll be very, very quickly discounted. We worked very, very hard to have the opposite happen. I mean, this was covered by Financial Times, there were articles in The Guardian, New York Times, and so on. We really pressed hard, local media, print and radio. We worked very, very hard to ensure that as much publicity was drawn to the
BBC.
Well,
you said that?
Well, first of all, we were realising this kind of more philosophic value of publicity, but there was a strategic importance to this, which is actually to try and force politicians' hands. We know that politicians, if it doesn't kind of gel with what they want to hear, they're very quick to kind of ignore it or discount it. And we want to actually work against that, because again, the idea is democracy is ruled by the people, and these are the views of informed people. They should be heard, and they should factor into public policy. Whether it'll do it or not, again, is an open question. It has been discussed at governmental level. Whether it'll be taken up or not, or how exactly it'll actually filter into what comes out the far end, I don't know. But as I say, publicity is a key part of deliberative polling that I forgot to mention earlier on, but I think is designed specifically to counteract the kind of worry that you're raising. Again, we've had a couple of questions from Francis and yourself about the numbers. I mean, I must come clean and say we would have preferred bigger numbers. We would have hoped to have had about 250, because it would give us stronger claims. It would have generated more robust findings. So I must admit that there is an issue about that. We have gone back now to actually try and kind of bolster the numbers. We have gone back a control group, although we haven't actually analysed the data from the control group yet, to actually give us more substance, give us more numbers to play with. Yes, 120 odd is a big number, as these things go, but for a deliberative poll, given the numbers that we started with, we had a considerable drop-off that we were actually disappointed. Having said that, as David has said on kind of numerous occasions here, many of the findings are statistically significant. You can blow them up from the small group to the big group and stand over them, because the participants themselves were representative on most, not all issues. Gender, for example, we had an over-representation, an imbalance of women in relation to men. But again, that could have had to do with the issue.
So I should just say on that issue, I mean, Ian picked out some of them, and whenever he says blowing it up, the demographic questions that we asked were quite robust, and I don't have copies of the poll. It is available online at Stanford's website at the minute, and anyone who wants a hard copy, if you give me your name, I'll send it to you. But I mean, we asked them lots of questions. We asked them marital status, we asked them employment status, we asked them about their educational background, trying to get the sort of social class, in terms of social class. We asked them about religion. We asked them about political affiliations. We went through a whole raft of standard demographic questions. And the sample at ×2, at the 121 who took the questionnaire at ×2, was representative with no large statistical significant difference from the much larger sample as a whole, the 560. The Stanford team also went back and blew it up on the basis of the census data, and we know that the sample at 565 was largely representative of the census data of 2001 for the Alma area. So a lot of the issues can be blown up in them and would hold for a much larger sample in terms of demographics.
I mean, having said that, though, we still take the point that you get more robust statistical findings if you have a bigger sample, but it was still big enough, we think, to come up with kind of important results. Just one very quick point before I hand over to David for the second one, and again I think it's implicit in the questions that we did present this already to Belfast City Council, and one of the things I should say, well, I guess that was, I can't say any details, of course, but cautiousness is, you're absolutely right, people are very cautious about change. It's not just people in our sample are cautious about change, politicians themselves are incredibly cautious about change. And they are fearful of change. And that's why, that's one of the things I think that's about deliberative polling that perhaps policymakers don't like. The results are uncertain. We don't know what's coming out the far end because we don't push consensus. We don't push any particular line, which again adds to the objectivity of the whole thing. It's just whatever informed people think. It's none of our business. So we like to think it's democratic for those kinds of reasons. I mean, David works here in the policy sector. I don't. James Fishkin, Bob Lushkin, they don't work here, but they're interested in what would inform people think. But we have no vested interest in any particular kinds of answers. But nor should we have for the kinds of reasons I alluded to at the start.
Okay, I'll try and pick up a couple of them. Are they more likely to listen? Well, I'd say the difference between a deliberative poll and a standard social attitude survey is it engages the stakeholders right from the outset. The people who have to make the decisions are there right from the beginning of the process. To a certain extent, they have ownership almost of the process. It's their process. It's the people who take part, their process. In many ways, the academic team are merely facilitators. So in that regard, to the extent that they have bought in to the process from the outset, it's more likely, I would say, to have policy impact. Now, we know, without going into a lot of detail about it, but we know that the poll in Alma has had policy impact from discussions that we've had since the results have been out, particularly in the Alma area. We also know it has potential in other areas as well from discussions. So I think, without going into a lot of detail about it, the poll has had impact. Now, whether other sorts of methodologies have had equal impact, well, people who did them have to talk to that for themselves, but we know that the poll has had impact. We've sort of dealt with the issue of, sufficient numbers. Ideally we would have more, ideally you always would have more, regardless of the methodology. In terms of the weighting for the Protestant sample, and Ian, keep me right here, because as Ian has said, we are definitely not the statistician in terms of the project, but I know that the issue with regard to the Protestants was, whilst there were more Protestants the second time round, whenever we look at the Protestants that made up the sample the first time round, the difference in terms of their overall percentage, there was no statistically significant differences. So the sample as a whole on all demographics remained representative. If it hadn't have been on one of the, well then we might have faced that issue, but whilst Protestants were overrepresented, there wasn't enough of them for to make any dent in terms of reading the data. So I know I've fudged that a little bit, but it really wasn't an issue for us. But if I'll get you an answer to what happens if you want in the instance that may occur. How long lasting is it? Well, that that is the million-dollar question. Do people go away from a deliberative poll, and do they retain their position 6 months down the line, a year down the line? The only way of knowing that is to go back and do the questionnaire with the treatment group again in January. And if you know any nice funder that's willing to give me the money to do that, just send them to my door, and I'll by all means will go out and do it. But at the minute we don't know. Again, I don't know whether you know if Jim has done that on other polls. I think so on some polls they have went back, maybe in Australia, where they were looking at Aboriginal land rights. Yeah. They went back, I think, in that instance, and I think I'm right in saying that the preference transformations held up. But for me, I have to say, if you look at the poll results as a whole, whilst people's positions, the preference transformation, the issue of whether it holds or not, is very interesting. Actually, in the majority of questions, people's preferences didn't change when you take the sample as a whole. What deliberation did was confirm them in their original position. So whilst a lot of deliberation and a lot of deliberative theorists, because Ian and I have had a raging debate over the past couple of days of this, a lot of deliberative democratic theory has focused in on the point of deliberation being preference transformation. From a policy perspective, it's entirely irrelevant whether people change their opinions or not. For many years, people have had a particular position in many social attitude surveys with regard to the mixing of communities. All our deliberative poll did was confirm that, but it confirmed it in a very different way from polls that have taken place previously, because we were able to show the representativeness, and we're also able to show the knowledge gains, and we're also able to show that at the instant when they took the poll, they were thinking differently. Now, whether they still think differently 6 months down the line, in many ways, is an irrelevance to us on that particular issue. They were thinking differently, and thinking differently either confirmed them in their position or it changed their preference. So I guess one way of doing it would be to go back and just ask the sample on those specific questions where they had preference transformation.
Mind you, what we can say is that their informed opinions are embodied in the results of the poll, and those results aren't going anywhere, if you get me. So even if they did, we could still say these were informed opinions, even if people themselves changed their minds afterwards, or went back to the original opinions, or went back to talking to people just like themselves. It wouldn't matter because our results are what they are.
Just to say that a lot of people came into the room of those small groups in which the deliberation took place with relatively similar views that they had arrived at from completely polar opposite positions. So, for example, in my group was a teacher in the maintained sector, a parent who had wanted to send their child to an integrated school but didn't feel was one close enough, a parent who had pulled out all the stops to send their child to an integrated school, and they were all pro-integrated schools, but they had arrived at that position that were so different. And in the course of the day, they debated those positions, they came to understand why the reasons that each had arrived at were very personal and very different, and would be all across Northern Ireland. So none of them actually changed their positions, and they all on the surface looked like they thought the same thing, but actually they thought entirely different things, which just led them to arrive at the same point in terms of the questions that were asked. And those people very much transformed how they thought, didn't change the box they ticked or the question they gave on the T3 poll, but their understandings of what that question meant and how other people had arrived at their decisions were completely different.
Yeah.
But the numbers were different.
Yeah. That's right.
Okay, a couple of final points. Yes, Brendan, the answer to me.
Just a comment on the deliberative polling in general. In your conversations with people like the department, if you've talked to the Department of Education and you've presented to Belfast City Council, if you've talked to some politicians, do you feel that it's likely that when it comes to area planning, deliberative polling will be a key player in the decision making, or it's something to do with the numbers game again? Are politicians likely to turn around and just say, well, you know, it sounds very interesting, but you know, you didn't really have enough people. If you know, I suppose politicians would say we'd like to hear everybody's opinion. Are they going to be easily persuaded that X% of the people in an area can give a representative vote or a representative opinion of all the people in that area? And do you think they're likely to use deliberative polling as a means of area planning?
When you say everybody's, key to the methodology is the idea of random sampling. So what we can say is what we're actually getting is a microcosm of, in our case, parents at large. And insofar as it is genuinely random, we can say, actually, no, yes, the numbers are small, but it's a genuine microcosm. If you blew this sample up, it would actually look like Alma as a whole.
And the only question is how likely are politicians to believe that? I mean, are they going to say, well, it's done it? You know, I'm hearing what you say, but you know, we need more people to get more people's opinion, really.
But surely, I mean, any debates on area plans and so on will use a mixture of different strategies to try to get at that. And I mean, so there might be traditional cross-sectional surveys, there may be deliberative polling, there may be more in-depth, again, focus groups or whatever, consultations. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, I think if Jim Fishkin, the guy who designed this, was here, he would say, no, all the rest are rubbish. Mine is the only one. And you have to,
we can't agree with that. We definitely can't agree with that.
You have to see the light, and if you haven't seen it, there's no point in talking to you. Anyway, so anyway, but you know, all different methodology will have their kind of respective strengths and weaknesses. This has particular strengths, which we think is a claim about information. People do become informed. It's not top of the head preferences. We think that's incredibly important because it counteracts one of the most fundamental objections about getting people involved in the first place, which is that the people are just ignorant. That's incredibly important, so we work very hard. The randomness we also think is very, very important because it allows us to make claims of representativeness. The publicity that I've alluded to already, we also think is very important because in a sense it can actually shame politicians into acting differently. They may be hypocrites, but that will be good enough as long as they're doing what people want. Well, that's good enough. I don't mind if they're hypocritical, if they don't really believe it deep down, tough luck. But of course you're right. I mean, the questions we're getting really, I think, you know, you have to understand the nature of the beast as well. Politicians hear what they want to hear and discount everything else. Yes, of course we know that. But as I say, unlike some other kinds of polling methodologies, the publicity effects of deliberative polling are specifically designed to counteract that kind of worry. It's not a panacea. This is not a kind of a universal remedy for all these kinds of difficulties. It's certainly not that. But I think it surpasses the other methodologies on that score, at least. I should say that I think I'm probably speaking for you as well, Dave. When I say this, we're not kind of entirely wedded to this. I mean, there are different ways of doing things. Different kinds of consultation processes are appropriate for different kinds of questions, and for different kinds of questions, different kinds of issues. It's not the only way of doing it, but we think that it has something the other ones don't have, and is well worth trying out. Which, I mean, your second question, would it be used for, did you ask me would it be used for different issues? Was that the question? What was the second part? It was
really just about the numbers. It was really rolling, because politicians will say, no matter what you give them, they'll say, well, there weren't enough people.
Well, again, I mean, all I can say to that is, this was intelligently, I think at least, discussed on BBC, and these issues, again, were raised. Politicians were not able to make those kinds of claims, because it wouldn't have stood up. I mean, those claims are easily put down. They actually don't hold up. If you explain to somebody what randomness is, and you can show what randomness is, and it's just, in a sense, it's a factual matter. So politicians can say what they like, but hopefully, on the right kinds of contexts, the appropriate kinds of discussions surrounding them, the appropriate kind of fora, like, as I say, television, they can't get away with that kind of thing.
Okay, well, I'm going to draw the discussion to a close. We do have some tea, coffee and sandwiches at the back, so we can follow up conversations. But I want to thank David and Ian very much indeed for a very interesting contribution to our seminar series. It's most interesting to us to hear about the methodology, but it's also very interesting to see the findings. I mean, as someone who's involved with running cross-sectional surveys on an annual basis in Northern Ireland, I have to say that I would argue that cross-sectional surveys can also impact on policy. I do believe that the time series that we've generated, that David's alluded to a number of times, is informing policy and hopefully from time to time impacting on policy. But nonetheless, it was very, very interesting, and as I say, I knew a little bit about it before, so it was very interesting to see how it's worked in the Northern Ireland context on such an interesting topic, and as you say, such a very live topic, given even the last week's debates and discussions with the Minister's announcements. So thank you very much indeed. Just before we formally conclude, could I ask